What were the top 10 greatest Roman emperors of all time? This is certainly a question that every fan of Roman history often asks him or herself. From the first emperor Augustus to the very last emperor Constantine XI, there were so many great emperors that saved the Roman Empire time and time again from the brink of destruction. We have many famous ones that everybody knows, but we also have underrated ones, underdogs, that have somehow been forgotten by history and that deserve a lot of recognition for their incredible deeds. So who then were the 10 greatest Roman emperors of all time? Before beginning, of course, I have to mention that this is a very subjective list, and there is no purely rational and objective way to rank Roman emperors. There will always be some certain bias involved, because we will never value things exactly the same way. When looking at certain emperors, I took into account their contributions to the Roman Empire and their legacy, as well as their impact onto the Roman world. So an emperor, for instance, that did not reign long but had a huge impact, would be higher on the list than someone who reigned for a long time but did nothing noteworthy, or was even detrimental for the Roman Empire. So then let's begin. 10. Valentinian I. Now this is a surprise. Why would Valentinian I be on the list? Was he not after all a brute who was famous for outbursts of anger? Well, that might be, if we are to believe the contemporary accounts, and we know that that's always a big if, then he certainly had a temper. However, he made up for that shortcoming with his very successful campaigns where the Western Roman Empire would show itself from its strongest side for one of the last times ever. He successfully campaigned against the Alemanni, who had invaded Gaul in 365 and drove them back over the Rhine. He also defeated the Saxons in northern Gaul and invading Quadi and Sarmatians in Illyricum. He was possibly the last emperor to even campaign into Germania, into Alemanni and Quadi territory, and he restored many of the old border fortifications and even built new ones, even in enemy territory, which naturally enraged the barbarians quite a lot. We can really say that this was the last time that the border fortifications of the Western Roman Empire were made strong again, and that the Western Roman Empire even dared to campaign in Germania beyond the Limes. In religious matters, he was surprisingly tolerant for a Christian emperor, even allowing the pagans to continue worshipping the old gods, which was really not a given in times of growing religious intolerance from the side of the Christian emperors. Thanks to his very capable Magister Equitum Theodosius, he was also able to put down a rebellion in Africa. Unfortunately, he died in early 375 after reigning for 11 years, supposedly from a stroke while shouting enraged at a Quadi envoy. So all in all, even though he might have had some character deficiencies, he was certainly great for the Western Roman Empire. 9. Heraclius. Now this was a close one for me, and I had to decide between Maurice and Heraclius. Both had to fight against huge invasions and both were successful until suddenly they weren't. However, Heraclius has to be commended for saving the Roman Empire from total and complete destruction during the Great Sasanian War of 602 to 628. He also has to be commended for ending the reign of Phocas, possibly the worst Roman emperor of all time, who not only had killed the very capable Maurice, but whose fault it actually was that the Sasanian War had erupted in the first place. After Phocas was out of the way, Heraclius was fighting his entire reign against the Persians. The Persians, under their king Khosrau II, went on the offensive in the most devastating way ever seen in the entire history of almost 700 years of war between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. The Persians conquered much of the Levant and Egypt and much of Anatolia, and by 626 had even allied themselves with the Avars and were besieging Constantinople itself. But the walls of the mighty fortress city held and the Persians were driven back. Heraclius went on the offensive and penetrated deep into the Persian heartland, causing great devastation in Persian territory, which caused a civil war that would see Khosrau killed and replaced by someone friendly to the Romans, which ended the war and ceded all captured territory back to the Romans in 628. But even as the Romans thought that the worst was over, a new threat emerged only some years later and overran the completely drained provinces of the Eastern Roman Empire and Persia, both empires having been totally drained of manpower from the 26 years of brutal warfare. By that time, Heraclius was too old to go into war himself, and so having saved the Roman Empire already before, he now had to watch it fall apart. But his reforms laid the basis for the survival of the empire in that he ended the corruption of Phocas's reign and reorganized the military with great success. So even though he could not reconquer the lost territory from the Muslims, he had defeated the Persians and had laid the foundation for the continuation of the Roman Empire for many more centuries, and thus is, for me at least, a very great emperor. And if you are a Rome nerd like me, and chances are pretty high that you are if you are watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. There's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can get a 10% rebate on every purchase if you type in the rebate code Maiorianus. So go and check out their assortment, it's really quite incredible. 8. Majorian. Majorian has been called by Procopius of Caesarea the most virtuous Roman emperor who had ever lived, and by Edward Gibbon the welcome discovery of a great and heroic character such as sometimes arise in a degenerate age to vindicate the honor of the human species. These are certainly words of high praise, and indeed, not without reason have I named this channel after Majorian and dedicated it to his memory. He was born in a dark time, and he indeed would have deserved to live in better times, but he was thrust into the dying years of the Western Roman Empire. And when he became emperor in 457 AD, the Western Roman Empire might have already been beyond redemption. For not only was it surrounded by enemies from without, but also infiltrated by enemies from within. Immediately upon ascending to the Western throne, he started issuing laws and reforms that were to tackle the fundamental problems of the Western Empire, such as ending corruption, protecting the monumental buildings of Rome, increasing the birth rate of the Romans, or allowing citizens to wear arms for protection. In 458 he recruited a large foederati army with which in the time span of only 2 years he reconquered the lost parts of Gallia and Hispania, basically doubling the territory of the Western Roman Empire in that short time frame, and even convincing Marcellinus of Dalmatia to factually rejoin the empire. But his final act, that would have seen the complete restoration of the Western Roman Empire, unfortunately failed, and so he cannot be put higher on the list of the greatest Roman emperors. Had he succeeded, he would be up there on place 1 or 2, but alas, his fleet was burned in the harbor by traitors even before it could embark on the reconquest of Africa. And when after this failure he returned to Italy, he made the mistake of disbanding his army, thus having no defense against the Magister Militum Ricimer, who intercepted him and had him killed in cold blood. Majorian had the big flaw that apparently he was too trusting. He did not foresee the treachery of Ricimer, and apparently he had also not foreseen that traitors might be burning his ships. He could have been the greatest Roman emperor of all time, but even with his flaws, he still achieved an incredible amount in such short a time and possibly gave the Western Roman Empire a few more years to live. 7. Constantine XI. Of course, the last Roman emperor needs to be on the list. Even more so because he might have possibly been one of the most heroic characters ever, and will always be remembered for his incredible bravery during the last battle for Constantinople. While Majorian was already born in bad times, Constantine probably would have envied Majorian for the times he lived in. In 1405, when Constantine XI was born, the Roman Empire could not even be called an empire anymore. By that time it consisted basically almost only of the city of Constantinople itself and the surrounding area, then Thessalonica and then parts of the Peloponnese. But by the time he became emperor in 1449, even that would have seemed nice, because by that time the Roman Empire really only consisted of Constantinople itself, being surrounded on all sides by the Ottoman Empire. And it is doubtful if Constantinople could be even called a city by that time. It had never recovered from the brutal Crusader sack of 1204 and was more a patchwork of small villages amidst old decaying ruins of the great imperial times, with fields and greenery in between. The situation was grim, but even so, Constantine tried his best with diplomacy to gather support from the west, but also to hinder the new Sultan from attacking Constantinople. Ultimately, though, his plans failed because the new Sultan had at some point set his mind to conquer the old city of Constantine. And from the west, very little reinforcements were sent, so that when the siege began in April of 1453, it was 80,000 Ottomans versus possibly only 6,000 to 8,000 Romans and Venetians. But despite the numerical advantage and the use of cannons, the Ottomans still had a lot of trouble taking the city, and for over 6 weeks were repelled again and again. Only in late May then did the tide turn towards the Ottomans, and Constantine then knew that his city would fall. But instead of fleeing, he fought until the very end. The city could have been easily saved had larger reinforcements arrived from the west, but alas, the bad relationship between the Latins and the Eastern Romans and the schism would now be the undoing of the city. And when the walls were breached, it is written that Constantine said, "The city is fallen, yet I am still alive." And with these words he charged with the last few remaining men into the Ottomans, where he fell. And for this incredible valor, Constantine XI is rightly up there with the greatest Roman emperors of all time. 6. Basil II. The Eastern Roman Empire was often on the brink of complete destruction, and yet saw many times miraculous recoveries that nobody thought possible. And such a recovery was during the rule of Basil II. We could say that actually this was the last time that we could call the Roman Empire really an empire in more than name, when indeed it stretched from the far east in Armenia to the southern shores of Italy. In those days, the city of Constantinople itself was for the last time an impressive city, far surpassing all other cities of Europe in its sheer size and splendor. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in the ancient Roman capital, possibly up to 500,000, in a time when even London had a ridiculous 25,000 and Paris an even more measly 20,000 inhabitants. Indeed, even in 1204, when the Crusaders saw the city for the first time, they could not believe their eyes, for never before had they seen such a vast city, so splendorous and impressive. And even though Constantinople had not been the imperial capital of old anymore, with many of its old Roman fora already decayed, still it had in many places the old feel of a Roman ancestry, with many of the old statues still surviving. And Basil II was the last emperor in a long line of quite successful emperors who brought the Roman Empire back from near total collapse. Even though Basil was a soldier who successfully campaigned in the Balkans and the far east of the empire, one of his greatest achievements was the rekindling of the old literature, arts and learning, almost a revival of antiquity. During his reign, there was a notable influence of classical Greek scholarship on Christian art and a widespread study of ancient Greek philosophy. As a result, the University of Constantinople experienced significant growth in its library thanks to the exploration of these subjects and the ambitious enlargement projects initiated by him and his predecessors. Consequently, the University of Constantinople regained its position as the primary center of knowledge during that era. Despite not being inclined towards literature, Basil actively engaged in the development of churches, monasteries, and to some extent cities, demonstrating his devout nature. He was also the longest ruling Roman emperor at almost 50 years of rule. Therefore, Basil II was a restorer, the likes of which the Roman Empire would never again see afterwards. 5. Justinian. 500 years before Basil, the Roman Empire had just lost its western half. What is commonly but wrongly referred to as the fall of the Roman Empire, in reality only concerned the western half of that vast empire. The eastern half, however, not only survived, but went on a massive reconquest campaign, the likes of which had been deemed impossible by most contemporaries. And it was under the rule of Justinian that the Eastern Roman Empire would go on to reconquer many of its lost possessions, completely reconquering the Vandal and the Ostrogothic kingdoms, utterly destroying them and even reconquering the south of the Visigothic kingdom. In just a few decades, the size of the Roman Empire increased by more than 50%. Of course, this would not have been possible without the military genius of one of the greatest military commanders of all time, namely Flavius Belisarius. However, we must credit Justinian with even conceiving such an ambitious plan and setting it into motion. He was also one of the most prolific builders in Roman history, on par with the likes of Augustus, Trajan or Maxentius, building the Hagia Sophia that surpassed many of the greatest ancient buildings of Rome itself in its sheer size and magnitude. He also codified Roman law into a compendium of such a complexity that it would serve as the foundation for modern law. During his almost 4 decades of reign, the Roman Empire saw a revival of an incredible scale. Many new cities were built throughout the empire, from the Balearic Islands to cities such as Justiniana Prima in modern-day Serbia. The last great statues of antiquity were built in his age. Many great works of art, such as the Column of Justinian and mosaics, flourished and became incredibly complex in that time. Of course, he was not free from character flaws. He brutally suppressed the Nicarites in 532 in Constantinople, although this might have possibly been due to his wife's persuasion, and he did not give Belisarius enough support on his campaigns. He also was religiously very intolerant, defunded the last Neoplatonic schools, and instigated anti-pagan persecutions. We could even say that he might have overstretched the Roman Empire, but this is applying unfair hindsight, because he did not know what would come afterwards. Thus, Justinian was certainly a flawed character, but still a great emperor when the Roman Empire was for the last time an incredibly large empire. 4. Augustus. Of course, the first Roman emperor must be included on the list of the greatest Roman emperors because he was the one who started it all. Now, of course, you could say that this was a bad idea from the beginning because the Principate would actually end the Roman Republic. But then again, the Roman Republic was also unstable and had succumbed into a series of brutal civil wars. And Gaius Octavius, the great nephew of the legendary Caesar himself, emerged victorious from the civil war. The Roman Republic had become so utterly unstable that he understood that the only way to save this fragile Roman state was to come up with a new system of government. And thus he invented the Principate, wherein the emperor himself was officially the first among equals, the Princeps Senatus, first of the Senate. So officially he was just the head of the Senate, while in reality he wielded immense power and had effectively become emperor. Fascinatingly, the Roman Senate itself awarded Octavian with all these powers, but then again, they might have possibly feared him because they understood the position of power that Octavian had gained through his victories in the Roman civil wars. And thus we could say that Octavian might have saved the Roman state from disintegration into rivaling states that else might have possibly continued to fight each other. He went on and continued to conquer new territories, and the now Roman Empire would continue to grow even more under his 41-year-long reign. The city of Rome itself saw an incredible transformation, with many new impressive buildings having been built on a staggering scale. So much so that it was said that when he started his reign, Rome was a city of bricks, and when he died, it had been transformed into a city of marble. He laid the foundation for a 200-year lasting period of the Pax Romana, the glory days of Rome, where even though some emperors would prove to be quite mad, the Roman Empire still saw a very prosperous time, which he had allowed to happen. Of course, he also had flaws. Under his rule, the province of Germania was lost, and choosing Tiberius as his successor might also not have been the best idea. However, his accomplishments were outstanding, and for many, therefore, he was actually the greatest Roman emperor of all time, and I fully acknowledge this assessment. 3. Marcus Aurelius. However, while Augustus was certainly great with regards to virtue, almost nobody comes close to Marcus Aurelius. We don't know of many emperors who were quite as wise, just, and modest in their rule as Marcus was. As a child already, Marcus had been introduced to Stoic philosophy, which would continue to be a big influence on his entire life, guiding him through all his actions and allowing him to have a calm and rational mind, the likes of which almost no Roman emperor would ever achieve again. He wrote down his thoughts in his famous Meditations, which he actually never intended to be published, where he revealed his way of applying Stoic philosophy to everyday problems and even to a way of thinking itself. At the age of 17, he was chosen by the then reigning Emperor Hadrian, whose health was deteriorating rapidly, to be made emperor after his immediate successor Antoninus would pass away. And thus, after Hadrian had died, Aurelius Antoninus became emperor, later known as Antoninus Pius, and he adopted young Marcus to become the future emperor. After the death of Antoninus in 161, Marcus became sole emperor, but he soon chose Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, as his co-emperor. Unfortunately, he would not reign in peace for long. Already in 161, war with the Parthian Empire broke out, then rebellion was brewing in Syria in 162. In 165, an unknown deadly disease spread in the empire, killing millions, thought to have been smallpox. And around the same time, Germanic tribes, the Marcomanni and Quadi, broke through the border fortifications, killing many Romans and sacking entire cities, even threatening Italy itself and laying siege to Aquileia. Lucius Verus died in 169, probably killed by smallpox. This unprecedented series of calamities might have overwhelmed many emperors, but Marcus remained calm thanks to his Stoic teachings. Thus, he was able to drive back the invaders behind the limes, ended the rebellion in Syria, won the Parthian War, and even campaigned deep into Germania in the homeland of the Marcomanni and Quadi, planning to establish the new Roman province of Marcomannia. But he then died in 180, and thus his plans were cut short. The only mistake he made was to make his son Commodus his successor, ignoring the warnings of Commodus's teachers as to the bad character of his son. This indeed was a grave mistake, and this prevents Marcus from being called the greatest Roman emperor of all time. Yet still, despite this mistake, he saved the Roman Empire from a very dangerous situation, and with his calm and stoic mind and his just rule, was beloved by many and rightfully one of the best emperors of all time. 2. Aurelian. Having long been neglected or even overlooked by historians, it becomes more and more clear that Lucius Domitius Aurelianus almost single-handedly saved the Roman Empire from complete collapse during the crisis of the 3rd century. In his too short reign of only 5 years, he defeated countless invading Germanic tribes, namely the Alemanni, the Goths, the Vandals, Jutungi, Sarmatians, and the Carpi. Many of these tribes were threatening Italy itself, but he defeated them in the battles of Fano and Pavia. He then drove back the Goths beyond the Danube and evacuated the province of Dacia, which could not be held onto anymore. His victories earned him the titles Germanicus and Gothicus Maximus. In Rome, he ordered huge defensive walls to be built that still stand and bear his name. Then in 272 and 273, he defeated the split-away Palmyrene Empire with its legendary Queen Zenobia, earning him the titles Particus Maximus and Restitutor Orbis. Zenobia was paraded through the streets of Rome in golden chains in one of the most splendorous triumphs of Roman history. But he did not rest for long, since there was still the split-away Gallic Empire in the west. He went on the offensive in 274 and defeated this split-away empire at the Battle of Chalons at Duro Catalaunum. Thus, in only 4 years, he had basically defeated all barbarian invaders and the two split-away empires, consequently securing the borders of the empire and reunifying it. Hence, he was given the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World, for basically saving the Roman Empire. Of course, he also had help from his predecessor emperors or his successor Emperor Probus, but it is undeniable that without Aurelian, history really might have gone down a very different path, and the Roman Empire might have fallen then and there in some different form from how it fell in our timeline. He enacted many reforms and tried to establish the cult of Sol Invictus as the new main religion of the empire. He also tried to reform the deteriorated Roman currency and establish a new food distribution system for the poor. But alas, he tried too much at once in a time where emperors were regularly murdered by rebellious troops. And so we thought, while at it, why not also completely defeat and conquer Persia, the eternal enemy in the east? So he embarked to the east with his army, but he never arrived there. On his way from Thrace to Asia Minor, he was murdered by one of his soldiers who feared a punishment for having told a lie and so instigated a conspiracy against Aurelian. Aurelian wanted to end corruption in the army, but alas, the army was corrupt to the core. And so ended this heroic reformer and soldier, the restorer of the Roman world. Such seems to often be the fate of the best rulers, too good for the corrupt times in which they lived and wanting to solve too many problems at once, making themselves too many enemies. But even in his short time as emperor, Aurelian achieved so much as to even warrant him the first place. This is purely a matter of personal preference. 1. Trajan. Trajan could be, and that is of course just a subjective opinion, called the best Roman emperor of all times. And actually the Roman Senate itself called Trajan Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. Every time a new Roman emperor would be acknowledged by the Senate, it was done with the wish Felicior Augusto melior Traiano, be luckier than Augustus and better than Trajan. And Trajan really did earn that reputation. Under his rule, Rome reached the zenith of its power, purely from the extent of its huge empire, but also with regards to fiscal policy, architecture, infrastructure building, industrial output, complexity of its art, and other metrics. He was not only an excellent commander who had conquered Dacia and made it a new Roman province, he also expanded the empire far into the east, defeating the Parthian Empire so utterly that not only was the capital Ctesiphon sacked, but 3 new provinces were created in the far east. Armenia, which reached as far as the Caspian Sea, then Mesopotamia and Assyria, that reached as far to the southeast as the Red Sea. A territorial expansion that Rome would never again reach. But he was also a prolific builder, embarking on an unprecedented building program thanks to the fiscal surplus reached by defeating the Dacians. With the help of his master architect Apollodorus of Damascus, he built the magnificent Column, Forum and Markets of Trajan, which would remain in use for more than 700 years and were still standing until they were destroyed by an earthquake in 847 AD. But he also had many roads, aqueducts and bridges built, also many military forts and many temples throughout the empire. He ruled justly and established a rule of law that would treat all Roman citizens fairly. He even treated the poor with respect and sought to end poverty in the Roman Empire by introducing an alimenta system, a program that provided financial support and food to impoverished people. This initiative showcased his compassion and dedication to alleviating poverty and ensuring the well-being of all Roman citizens. Thus, he was not only a very successful military commander and a just ruler, but also appears to have been kind and compassionate, a very rare quality indeed in Roman emperors. His flaw might have been that one could say that he overstretched the Roman Empire, but then again, one could always make that case for every large expansion of the Roman Empire. Thus, for me, Trajan can rightly be called the best Roman emperor of all times. Honorable mentions. Nerva. Nerva was a good emperor, but he ruled for too short a time to have made a lasting impact. However, he laid the basis for the golden era of the 5 good emperors, and his greatest accomplishment was possibly selecting Trajan as his successor, thus initiating the 100 greatest years of the Roman Empire. Hadrian. Hadrian was also a very good emperor and almost would have made it into the top 10 list. However, his character was quite flawed, and if we are to believe his contemporaries, he must have thrown quite the fits of rage from time to time and was a much more autocratic ruler than Trajan. He of course was a great emperor all in all, and you could also make a strong case to put him in the top 10. This is just a matter of personal preference. Antoninus Pius. I normally would have included Antoninus Pius in the top 10 because he was a very just, kind and modest ruler who taught Marcus Aurelius how to be a good emperor. From a purely character perspective, he would deserve to be on spot 1 to 3. However, it was his peacefulness that would set the stage for the later disasters of the 160s. But of course, that is an unfair applying of hindsight, so I can easily see him being in the top 5. Gallienus. Gallienus is possibly one of the most underrated Roman emperors. Not only did he defeat a huge army of the Alemanni at Mediolanum in 259 that had invaded Italy, but he also defeated multiple usurpers and also the invading Goths in 268. He was also the one to establish the first dedicated cavalry corps and to put a stronger emphasis on cavalry. So yes, one could easily also include him in the top 10. Claudius II Gothicus. Claudius II Gothicus is one of those great emperors that have been unrightfully neglected simply because they didn't reign long enough. But in his short 2 years of reign, Claudius defeated the Goths and the Alemanni, which was really important for the empire. Unfortunately though, he fell victim to the plague of Cyprian. Probus. Probus is also often unjustly forgotten, but he was also great because he reconquered the lost Agri Decumates province in Germania and defeated the Alemanni and completely crushed the Lugi, thus securing the borders of the Roman Empire. But he was unfortunately killed by his army, as so many emperors in those times. Diocletian. For many, Diocletian is one of the best emperors ever, and he indeed was a great reformer. It was him who introduced the Tetrarchy and stabilized the empire, but you could also make the case that this would later lead to the weakening of Rome, to civil wars, and to the ultimate splitting of the empire into an eastern and a western half. Maxentius. Maxentius might actually have been a great emperor, but basically everything we know about him comes from Constantine's propaganda, which completely distorts his persona. He was actually very tolerant towards Christians already before Constantine and was one of the most prolific builders of Roman history, almost on par with Trajan or Augustus, and so he also deserves to be counted among the greats. Constantine. For many he is great because of his legalization of Christianity, and he must be credited for establishing Constantinople, which would last for over 1,000 years. But one could also make the case that it was this shifting of the imperial power base to the east which weakened Rome and the Western Roman Empire, which might have actually hastened its demise. Julian. Flavius Julianus was a heroic character, but he was too hasty and wanted too much in too short a time. His great victories in Gaul were really important to stabilize the West, and he wanted to return Rome to its traditional religion and values. But his invasion of Persia was too rushed, which would be his downfall. He could have been in the top 10 had he successfully managed to defeat the Persians. Constantius III. Constantius III is often overlooked, but he was a great general that stabilized the Western Roman Empire and saved it from the brink of collapse, buying it several more decades. However, his reign as emperor was far too short, not even a year, before he died of disease, and had he reigned longer, I am sure he would be in the top 10. Leo I. Leo was actually the last Eastern Roman emperor to try everything in his power to help the Western Roman Empire, and as long as he lived, so was the West kept afloat. But as soon as Leo died of disease in 474, so basically died the last hopes of the Western Roman Empire, and for that, one could make a strong case to include him in the top 10. Anthemius. Anthemius is also often overlooked. He was a very good emperor, but had too little to work with, and by his time the Western Roman Empire was corrupt to the core. He was religiously very tolerant and educated in philosophy, and some say that he was a secret pagan. He tried to save the Western Roman Empire, but ultimately he underestimated the evil of Ricimer. Had he lived longer, he might have been counted among the greatest emperors. Maurice. Maurice was a very good emperor, and we could really say that with his death, so would the Roman Empire begin its downfall. He was the last emperor to campaign across the Danube like Trajan himself, and he almost defeated the Avars, but he underestimated the rebellious tendencies of his army, and so this was his downfall. Had he lived longer, he might have been one of the greatest Roman emperors ever, but even so, one can still make a strong argument as to include him in the top 10. I hope you enjoyed this somewhat different video. I seldomly make top 10 videos, but will do so from time to time because for whatever reason, my most successful video is a top 10 video, and so people seem to like that kind of stuff. Hence, I will try from time to time to make more top 10 or top 5 videos where we will try to rank all kinds of things or persons from the Roman Empire. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And please consider supporting my work on Patreon or via a YouTube membership, because the long-term sustainability of this channel really depends on your support. This channel would not work without our amazing Patreon and YouTube members, and I really want to thank each and everyone who is supporting this channel in any way. Gratias tibiago amici. And if you want to learn more about the life of the great Emperor Maiorian, you can watch this video here in the upper right corner, and I actually made an entire trilogy about his life. But if you want to learn more about the very underrated and neglected Emperor Maxentius, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.